Hey guys, welcome to Unit Presidency Lecture 3, alright, so notes 7 through 9, alright, today, and let's think about what we've done. We looked at initially what the presidency was supposed to look like for the framers, right? We have this idea that we looked at the Electoral College, we looked at some of the proposals at the convention, right? Plural executives, executive councils, kind of looked how the presidency emerged. Remember that generally Congress tended to dominate in the earlier part of this country, but then later the presidents have kind of expanded their powers, and we'll get into that a little bit more today. All right? Generally a crisis or a strong personality tends to enhance the presidency, right? Then we looked at the overviews, right? We looked at qualifications, terms of office, the 22nd Amendment, presidential succession, right, with the vice presidency, all right? And so now we kind of start looking in some more formal, we're getting into some of the powers of the president, right? So on page 7, it talks about all these roles of the president, okay? And so constitutional roles or formal powers. So the president as chief legislator. Now you got to think about this. The president doesn't obviously write legislation, but he has a huge impact on legislation in a number of ways, and that's what we're going to look at. So, first of all, he proposes legislation, right? He can use the State of the Union to propose legislation. He can use the regular media to propose legislation, but he suggests legislation or asks Congress to pass legislation for him. All right? And so that influences the nature of it, right? If there's a problem, he suggests it. He uses the electronic throne to put pressure on Congress. He can get legislation he likes, right? Okay, he can work with his party, he can work with the other party, that kind of thing to get legislation he likes. Now, some other things that he has power specifically linked to legislation is he can veto legislation, right? He can say no. And remember that the veto power can impact legislation because just a threat of veto can quite often force Congress to change legislation if they know they don't have the 2/3 majority to override that, all right? So he proposes legislation, he can veto legislation. No line item veto, as Clinton v. New York said, because it violates separation of powers, right? He can call a special session of Congress to make them work on legislation. And again, he makes the State of the Union address, and he'll lay out problems in America and then ask for legislation to fix those problems, all right? Now, these signing statements are interesting because signing statements are basically how a president says he's going to interpret the law, all right? Or even if he intends to enforce it, which a lot of people are like, wait a minute, if the Congress passes it, the president signs it, he should enforce it. But one of the things is he has a lot of broad powers in how to interpret legislation and how to enforce that legislation. Now, signing statements are a little more bold in which they're telling you, this is what I'm going to say about this language, and I may not even enforce that legislation, right? And we've seen an increase in those recently. All right, these signing statements. And there's even a question if those are constitutional or not. All right? All right, now remember checks. Congress can override a veto with 2/3 majority in both houses, right? Congress also doesn't have to pass legislation that the president suggests. All right? Okay. And now the chief executive. The chief executive, his job is to execute laws, his job is to execute treaties, and his job is to execute Supreme Court decisions, right? And that's what the take care clause of Article 2 says. It's like, these give you you carry out these things. You execute the law, you execute treaties, and you execute Supreme Court decisions. It's your job to enforce those things, all right? But again, what's interesting, like think about Colorado and Washington legalizing marijuana, or Oregon legalizing euthanasia, right? Those euthanasia and marijuana are both technically federal laws, or violate federal law, and yet the president has chosen not to enforce those, right? Okay. Okay. Now the other thing is the president's chief executive appoints officials to office and can fire them. That's the cabinet that we've been talking about, right? He also issues something called executive orders, all right? Now executive orders have the force of law, all right? So a president, and the examples you have in the notes from FDR to LBJ to Bush, all right? Look at those. But the idea is a president can say, George Bush created the Office of Homeland Security initially through an executive order. And what that was is he said, I create the executive, or the Department of Homeland Security, right? An executive order acts like a law but does not need to go through Congress. Now, the check on that is the Supreme Court can rule executive orders unconstitutional, and they only last, executive orders only last as long as the president's in office. So if Barack Obama signs an executive order for something, that executive order lasts until the next president comes, and that president can choose to continue that executive order or stop that executive order, all right? All right, and the other checks are Congress can pass laws that override that executive order. Congress also has the power of the purse, which means they can fund or not fund things. That is a check, all right? The Senate can also reject appointments. They can reject treaties that the president negotiates, right? And again, like we said, impeachment. If these executive orders they believe are horrible or wrong, the president can be impeached in the House with a simple majority and then convicted in the Senate with a 2/3 majority, right? All right. So, and the Supreme Court, again, can strike down executive orders as a violation of the Constitution. Remember that diagram I gave you? The Constitution is above everybody there. It is the supreme law of the land. All right. Now, as president is commander-in-chief, they're the head of the armed services. Now, this idea of civilian supremacy is that, we're one of the Western democracies tend to have elected officials in charge of their military, right? So what that means is if a president is going to use the military, they have to account themselves to the electorate, right? And in other countries, there'll be, the generals are in charge of the military and the president's not in charge of the military, right? Controlling where they go, when they go, how they act, that kind of thing. All right, and they're often used in other countries to challenge the power of other branches of government. The military, like the military in Pakistan, is a huge influence over elected officials because of their power. All right, now, the president, the commander-in-chief, they send us to war, right? Now, not declare war. All right, now again, the checks, Congress can appropriate funds for the military, so if they don't like a military action, they can not fund it to limit the president's ability to send troops. The Congress declares war, so technically, we haven't been at war since, right, World War II. We haven't had a congressional declaration of war, right? So, now the War Powers Act we'll get into later. That was when the Congress tried to limit the president's inserting troops around the world as commander-in-chief without a declaration of war, all right? Now, chief diplomat, remember, diplomacy is this idea of them interacting with other countries around the world, leaders with other countries from around the world, right? So they set the overall foreign policy, meaning they dictate U.S. foreign policy for the most part, all right? And we tend to think of the president in foreign policy as stronger than a president in domestic policy or policies that are right at home, all right? That's the Two Presidencies thesis by Aaron Badalski, which says presidents tend to have more success in national security issues. Presidents tend to have more success in foreign policy than they do local or domestic issues because they get challenged by Congress quite often in local or domestic issues, but not necessarily always the case in external issues like foreign policy. All right, but they do. Absolutely, they still get challenged. Now, they appoint and receive ambassadors, right? Ambassadors are the representatives of countries around the world and our country around the world in which we send those people to represent us. We have an ambassador to Sweden. We have an ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. We have an ambassador to France. And they're kind of the point person in which our president sends those people to conduct foreign policy and negotiate and discuss and have diplomatic relations with other countries, all right? So they appoint them, but they still have to go through Senate confirmation, and they receive them, which means other countries will send their ambassadors to meet the president, right? Like that's generally the one point of contact. All right. Now again, the president can negotiate treaties and executive agreements. Now, a treaty is a treaty. A president will go to another country, they'll negotiate. So a president's job is to negotiate what's in the treaty, but then a treaty has to be approved by the U.S. Senate again, all right? A treaty has to be approved by the U.S. Senate. Now, an executive agreement is just like the executive order that we looked at a minute ago. An executive agreement acts like a treaty, but does not need to be confirmed by the Senate, all right? So a president can, and again, the limit on that is the Supreme Court can strike them down as unconstitutional. Congress cannot fund these treaties or the executive agreements, and they only last for the term of office that a president's in office, right? So if Barack Obama signs an executive agreement with another country for some issue, it technically only lasts until a new president comes. And again, a new president can either sign that and say, yes, I want to continue that executive agreement, or they can say, no, I want to get rid of this executive agreement, all right? Now, the other thing is, the president gives diplomatic recognition to other countries, all right? In 1948, when Israel was created, we were the first to recognize it. Just recently, Sudan was split into two, and the South Sudan and the North Sudan, and our country recognized it, and the person that formally recognized it is the presidency, right? The president tends to dominate in foreign policy, all right? Unless this foreign policy becomes incredibly unpopular, and then, Congress can check, the electorate can check, the courts can check, interest groups can challenge it, right? You can think of foreign policy just like laws, in which all those other various pressures are going to be putting pressure on Congress, interest groups, Congress, the bureaucracy, etc., the electorate. They're going to put pressure on the presidency in there, but the presidents tend to have a strong foreign policy, and they get challenged a little bit more often in domestic policy. All right, they're chief of state, which means they're the ceremonial head of state. All right, just means, like the notes say, toss out a baseball, give the Medal of Honor, visit areas of natural disaster, that kind of thing. And a lot of countries like Great Britain will separate their chief executive, which carries out law, and their chief of state, which is the ceremonial head. So they have in Great Britain they have the prime minister and a monarch. All right, and then the chief jurist, meaning how they influence the courts, right? They appoint federal judges, and again, we're going to get into the courts later, but they appoint these guys for life terms, and they have to go through, if they're appointed, they have to be confirmed by the Senate. But again, a Democratic president is going to appoint Democratic judges. A Republican president is going to appoint Republican judges. So they won't use the word Republican or Democrat. They use conservative or liberal or moderate judges, right? So judges will interpret law, judges will interpret the Constitution, and judges will interpret treaties, and judges will interpret actions in our country from the states or whatever in the view or the ideology of the president, right? That's the idea as how he influences them, all right? And they also issue pardons and amnesty. So pardon is basically saying a person is free from jail or punishment. That's a pardon. And amnesty is a blanket pardon. So Jimmy Carter issued amnesty to all the people that had fled this country to avoid serving in the Vietnam War because they had technically violated the law. Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, right? And again, the idea is they can pardon anybody they want except somebody who's been impeached, all right? All right. And then look at the checks on this. The Senate can reject judicial appointments, the Senate can place holds on appointments, and the Senate can filibuster nominations, which means they don't have to approve the nominations, all right? But again, we have in the courts right now, we'll get to that in class. All right. So, and then some other roles. The president is technically the head of their political party, right? And they're responsible for the overall health of the economy, in which they say this is what we're going to try to do. But again, Congress is very much a partner in that. All right, Congress is absolutely a partner in that, but the president proposes the budget. Each year, the president will go to all the cabinet level agencies, the bureaucracy, and say, how much money do we need to run all of these, right? He'll get those numbers, and the Office of Management and Budget will help him prepare, right? And they'll give that budget to Congress, who has the power of the purse. And they'll say, can we have this, please? Right? And then Congress will go over the budget in committees and subcommittee hearings, right? They'll go ripping through it, because remember, congressional committees have oversight over specific bureaucratic agencies. The Department of Agriculture, there's a committee on agriculture in the House and the Senate that has oversight over them, so they'll hold hearings on the budget. And again, the Democrats and the Republicans, the different kinds of presidents, et cetera, different kinds of Congress, will have priorities in those budgets that either benefit their constituents, they think benefit this country, or reflect their ideological values. The budget very much shows what people value because they're either going to fund it or not fund it, right? Okay. All right, let's move to page 9 really quickly, all right? And again, this is just kind of a little bit of an overview of what we looked at before, all right? But again, the framers believed that it would be Congress, not the president, that would tend to dominate, all right? And again, in crisis mode or strong personalities, we've seen the presidency get more powerful, and then the opposite of that, we've seen the presidency be challenged by Congress, all right? And again, in the 20th century, with this kind of nonstop crisis that exists with, terrorism, nuclear war, the world is very quick, and so we kind of assume that there's this crisis that needs, immediate response, all right? So presidencies have gotten powerful. Now, look at these non-constitutional sources of presidential power. first and foremost, this unity of office. It's one person versus 535 people in Congress, right? And so one person is easier to connect with. One person is easier to make decisions on their own without worrying about being challenged in committees or subcommittees and leadership and party and caucuses and all that kind of stuff, right? So just the fact that it's one person that can then guide the bureaucracy, one person that can ask Congress for things, one person that can make decisions, it just makes them more powerful in the sense that they can act quicker. All right? And then, again, character and personality. Strong personalities tend to have better presidencies, or not better presidencies, but more vigorous or energetic presidencies, because they see the presidency as an office, to get things done, like Jackson, like the Roosevelts, like LBJ, right? They tended to, like Ronald Reagan, they tended to, their strong personalities tend to create stronger presidencies. All right? Now, the other thing is this idea of complexity of society. All right? Society is highly complex. Society, people demand that the federal government gets things done, and think about where they look. They don't look to the mob of people in Congress. They tend to look to the president as accountable for those things, and they say, you get this done. You're the president of the United States. Fix our problems. Solve these problems, whatever it is. And so we've kind of given, power to the president to get those things done. All right, now, D is huge in this on page 9, you guys. Congress gives authority to the executive branch. Like quite often, they'll complain about presidential power, but Congress often gives president's power. Look at this. They write broadly worded legislation and lets the executive agencies fill in the holes. By sending a broadly worded piece of legislation, Congress is saying, you figure out how to implement it. Here's the flavor of the law, but the specifics you can figure out and carry out. That gives tremendous power to the president. All right? In time of crisis, either foreign, economic, natural disaster, etc., Congress tends to bow to presidential demands because they know that we need quick action at that moment. And then also, think about when a president gets a mandate from the people. When Ronald Reagan got a huge electoral victory, what that means is, well, it probably means also that Congress is going to be that party too in that year, so the president may have unified government. But, when a president gets a mandate, quote, mandate from the people, meaning, overwhelmingly elected or overwhelmingly re-elected, the assumption in the media, the assumption in the public eye is that that person was elected because people thought they could get something done. Now let them get something done. All right? Okay, now the mass media, all right, has given the presidency the electronic throne. All right? And what this allows is this allows for a president to go to the public. This allows for a president to, transcend all the media chatter, all the social media, everything, and kind of have a speech, right? The president gave a speech 2 days ago on the NSA and its tactics, right? I mean, what that does is kind of all the media is quiet for a moment, and the president with the electronic throne is kind of, projected right into your TV, right into your radio, right into your iPad, whatever you're watching it on, and for those brief moments with the electronic throne, they can speak directly to the American people and make an appeal. Say, please let me do this, or please make Congress do this, or this is why I'm doing this, to justify it. And that can generate support for a president's policy. All right? Now, the other thing is the pace in which, these are all non-constitutional we're looking at, right? Powers of the presidency. The pace at which the world acts now, the speed at which the world acts, the fact that we were a superpower from World War II on, that the world looks to us, the presidency is seen as that kind of head of that to act quickly in moments of crisis, all right? And there's a daily crisis, whether it be Syria, whether it be, Iraq, whether it be, was a weird bald guy just screamed, "Go Dodgers." So, and so the power of the president in the post-World War II era, because of the crisis of the Cold War, because of the threat of Al-Qaeda and nuclear attack, the pace at which the world acts, there's a crisis. And so, but that also leads us back to, that doesn't mean domestically, that means foreign policy, the president tends to be powerful. All right? And again, now let's look just really quickly at Roman numeral 4. All right? Powers of the president are not clearly defined as they are in the Constitution for Congress. So what that does, right, is that the president's powers are generally vague, like you can carry out the law, you get to execute the law, right? That gives you tremendous power to interpret the Constitution to give you power. When you say, it doesn't say I can do this, but I think I can use this language to enable me to do it as president, right? It's kind of like the Constitution, in some sense, Article 2 is broad enough that it allows the president some wiggle room for defining their power. And then once we have a strong personality or a crisis in which a president gives themselves that power, the next presidents have that power because there's a precedent establishing that, right? Okay. But again, in times of crisis, presidents tend to be strong. In times of normal times, they tend to get challenged by the normal checks of Congress, interest groups, the electorate, state governments, that kind of thing. But again, don't forget that the courts can always challenge the actions of a president. All right, the Constitution definitely is the highest law in the land. However, the Constitution is a bit vague in that sense. All right? Okay, so that's generally it. All right, you guys have a good day. Ciao.